Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to another edition of History and Truth. Today we are in a different restaurant in Hirado. This place is called Anjin House. It's been here since 1502. Anjin was Mura Anjin. His English name was Will Adams. He was the first and probably only English samurai, and he lived here from 1605 to his death in 1620, upstairs in that apartment. He established the English trading house and trade with England as well as Holland in that period of time. Okay, so let's begin. As you can see, this building is very old, but the furniture isn't necessarily so old. This is obviously a new table and new chairs. Today, we are covering the early regiments that served in Nova Scotia. The first one we'll talk about is the 40th Regiment of Foot, also known as the 2nd Somersetshire. This is the cap badge of the regiment of the time. It was active from 1717 to 1881 and had 2 battalions at different times, although these battalions were very large. There was up to 20 companies of the 40th at any particular time, garrisoning forts all over the place, from Nova Scotia to New Brunswick to even Newfoundland. Okay, the 40th was founded in 1717 by this fellow. His name was the second governor actually, Governor of Nova Scotia, Richard Phillips. And he created the Nova Scotia Council also in 1720. So 40th Regiment was first called Phillips Regiment. It existed as that from 1717 to 1749, and its headquarters were for quite a while in Annapolis Royal and St. John's, Newfoundland. This is what a soldier of the 40th Regiment of Foot looked like at the time. Here is what a soldier of the 40th looked like in 1751. The 40th Regiment of Foot was briefly called Cornwallis's Regiment when it was moved to Halifax in 1749, and it was from 1750 to 1751 called Cornwallis's Regiment before gaining its numerical designation in 1751. The regiment served mainly out of Fort Anne and Annapolis Royal, but also out of Halifax once that was founded, and went on to fight in various conflicts such as the American Revolutionary War. It was garrisoned in Barbados in 1761 and served in the Boston area during the American Revolutionary War. Following that, in the French Revolution, they were once again garrison troops all over North America in the eastern area, and were even part of the soldiers who fought at the Battle of Waterloo, actually holding the important farm of Le Haye-Saint in the center of the battle. After that, it was sent on to various other places, such as New South Wales, which was the old name for Australia, and participated in the Black Wars, and also in the Siege of Kabul in later on, and at the Siege of Quetta became known as the most diseased regiment in the British Army. It later carried on until 1881, where it became the Lancashire, one of the Lancashire regiments. It'll eventually become the South Lancashire Regiment, and now is Lancaster Regiment. The Royal Fencible American Regiment of Foot, also known as the Royal Fencible Americans, the RFA. This unit was active from 1775 to 1783, and it was a provincial corps with an American command. There was one battalion of 5 companies. Its garrison headquarters was Fort Cumberland from 1776 to 1783. Fort Cumberland is Fort Beausejour. Notable commanders were Joseph Gorham, Thomas Butt, and Gifford Sturtholm. Now let's take a look at what the text says. The Royal Fencible American Regiment of Foot, or RFA, was a Loyalist battalion of infantry raised in 1775 to defend British interests in the colony of Nova Scotia. The RFA was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Gorham. Here it's hard to see, but the only image I could find, no, that's him, Joseph Gorham, throughout its existence. The most notable achievement of the RFA and its only combat as a regiment was the successful defense of Fort Cumberland during the Eddy Rebellion in November 1776, which prevented the revolution in the other American colonies from moving into Nova Scotia. The formation. Gorham was a prominent landowner in Nova Scotia in 1775, as well as a former officer of Gorham's Rangers. This Gorham was his father. Gorham's Rangers were active from 1744 to 1762, and garrisons were in Annapolis Royal and Halifax. It was majority Mohawks. And that was during the French and Indian War. Noting the growing tensions in New England and especially Boston between the government and the Patriot movement, he wrote the following to Governor Francis Lay. Proposed to raise a battalion of light infantry of Royal Fencible Americans to consist of 5 companies. 1 Lieutenant Colonel, Commandant and Captain, 4 captains, 1 Captain Lieutenant, 4 lieutenants, 5 second lieutenants or ensigns, 15 sergeants, 15 corporals, 5 drummers, 300 privates, 1 adjutant, 1 surgeon, and 1 surgeon's mate. That they be clothed and armed as light troops and put on the same establishment of pay as the late 80th Gauges Light Infantry, and this corps to be employed on the like services. Fencible troops differed from militia in that they were full-time soldiers and were paid. However, they differed from regulars in that they were exempt from overseas service. They were, in effect, a full-time secondary defense force. Defensive equals fencible. As a former ranger, Gorham proposed that his regiment serve as light infantry. In the event, they served as garrison troops for the regiment's existence. Gorham's proposal was accepted in April 1775, and recruiting began in Boston, Newfoundland, and in and around Halifax. The Boston men were shipped to Halifax in October. At that time, the approximately 200 men of the RFA comprised a large portion of the total British forces available in Nova Scotia. This situation changed briefly when General Howe's army arrived in Halifax from Boston in April 1776, but this army left again for New York in June. Meanwhile, rumors of rebellion stirring in the Cumberland region arrived in Halifax, prompting the authorities to dispatch Gorham's regiment to Fort Cumberland in late May, first overland to Windsor, and then by ship via the Minas Basin and Chignecto Bay. Fort Cumberland, originally built by the French as Fort Beausejour in 1750, was in an advanced state of disrepair in 1776. Gorham set his men to reconstruction, both the buildings and the earthworks, but work went slowly due to the shortage of supplies and equipment, and lack of assistance from the local population, who were mostly pro-patriot. They were kind of on the American side. With winter approaching, Gorham had his men put more effort into the accommodations than the fortifications. In spite of this, the fort would be a hard nut to crack by any rebel force without artillery. The Battle of Fort Cumberland. This is a 1775 map of the area. Fort Cumberland is D in the upper center, and the Owlac River is the unlabeled right branch of the Tantramar River in the upper left. here is the fort. And here's the Tantramar River. Okay, the fort was strategically important to the British as it guarded the overland route to peninsular Nova Scotia and also the upper reaches of the Bay of Fundy. The rebel forces, led by Colonel Jonathan Eddy, planned to capture the fort, seizing its artillery and stores as a first step in an overland march via Fort Edward in Windsor to Halifax, raising rebel sympathizers along the way. As there were some sympathizers in the colony, the plan was feasible. Here's a section of the Mitchell map showing some of the places in this action. Fort Lawrence is labeled Chignecto English Fort, and Windsor is labeled Fort Edward. Chignecto English Fort. Fort Edward. Gorham had deployed an outpost of 14 Fencibles under command of Lieutenant John Walker, a longtime friend of Gorham, to Chipoudy, now Chipoudy, New Brunswick. Here is the Beaumont Historic Site, Fort Folly Point, New Brunswick, which may have been the site of the Chipoudy outpost. In September, about 20 miles or 30 kilometers northwest of the fort, to warn of any approach by rebel forces from New England. On the evening of October 29, Eddy's arriving force of about 150 men overwhelmed the outpost, with one officer of the RFA, Second Lieutenant Solomon King, killed, and the rest taken prisoner. Lieutenant Walker was wounded. Eddy's men suffered no casualties. Gorham finally became aware of the rebel presence on November 4th, when a boat carrying a relief party and supplies for the outpost returned early with the news. By this point, Eddy's force had effectively cut all overland communications from the fort, making it impossible to send reports of the invasion to Halifax. Meanwhile, winter supplies, plus arms and ammunition for the garrison, had arrived on the sloop Polly. A sloop is a small naval vessel, quite a bit smaller than a frigate, closer to the size of a schooner, escorted by the frigate HMS Juno. On October 31st, Juno departed for Halifax on October 3rd. Polly was brought up a creek near the fort, and unloading began with the ship lying in the mud at low tides. Eddy's army staged its next coup on the night of November 6th to 7th, when a party of 30 men, led by Zebulon Rowe, set out to capture the Polly. After a difficult approach march over the tidal flats, with the tide rising, Rowe's men took the RFA party aboard by surprise and captured the sloop without firing a shot. Waiting for the rising tide, Rowe's men captured a work team and several officers coming to the ship. Finally, as the fog lifted around 7 a.m., the rebels were able to sail and tow Polly out of the creek, followed by cannon fire from the fort, which fell short and couldn't hit it. In all, Gorham lost 49 officers and men captured. Added to the men lost at the outpost, the RFA garrison was down 25% of its strength, plus most of the Polly's provisions. On November 9th, Michael Franklin, the former lieutenant governor, got word of the invasion from residents around the Minas Basin. He passed these reports to Halifax, where planning got underway to relieve the fort. Meanwhile, Eddy presented an ultimatum that Gorham surrender the fort on November 10th. Gorham replied with a demand that Eddy surrender instead. His bluff having failed, Eddy began planning for battle. Here is a model of Fort Cumberland at this time. Although the RFA was down to a strength of 172 all ranks, plus some armed civilians, it is unlikely that Eddy was able to persuade more than about 80 of his men to actually participate in any of the following attacks. So numbers were very much on Gorham's side. The first attack began at 4 a.m. on November 13th. A Maliseet warrior of Eddy's force managed to slip inside the fort, but was wounded by an RFA officer before he could open the main gate, foiling Eddy's plan. Here is a replica of a blockhouse at the site of Fort Howe, at the mouth of the St. John River. This area was fortified by the British in 1777 to deter privateering and other rebel activities. Fort Howe is now a museum in St. John, New Brunswick. Here is another image of Fort Cumberland, how it appears today. Fort Beausejour, Fort Cumberland, once again, is the same thing. After about 2 hours, Eddy disengaged. The warrior who escaped was the only casualty on either side. The second attack began in the early morning of November 22nd. This time the rebels set fire to several buildings to the north of the fort. This is the inside of one of the buildings today in Fort Cumberland. With a brisk wind blowing from that direction, it was hoped that the fire would spread to the fort, and it very nearly did so. One desperate but effective firefighting by the garrison prevented disaster. Eddy's men somehow failed to exploit their opportunity. Again, there were no fatal casualties on either side. Finally, on the morning of November 27th, the rebels tried to seize several dozen head of cattle from the marsh below the fort. This attempt was intercepted by 2 parties of picked men from the Fencibles. In the running fight that followed, several of Eddy's men were killed. The RFA lost 1 man, Peter Callahan, who died of wounds, and 2 others were wounded. Later that morning, the entire situation changed with the arrival of the sloop HMS Vulture, including a company of Royal Marines under Captain Branson, plus Major Thomas Batt and Captain Guilford Stutholm of the RFA, who had been on duty at Fort Edward. Before dawn on November 29th, Major Batt had a mixed force of Marines and 74 men of the Fencibles, led by Captain Stutholm. In a sortie from the fort against the rebel positions on Camp Hill, somehow Eddy had not noticed the arrival of Vulture, and the rebels were taken by surprise. When the alarm was finally sounded, the Fencibles gave a loud huzzah and ran like lions towards Eddy's headquarters. According to Batt's report to Gorham, Eddy was nearly captured and rebel resistance was broken. The homes of many rebels and sympathizers were burned. The RFA lost 1 man, Michael Dickey, killed, and 1 died of wounds, and 3 wounded. 1 Marine was wounded, and at least 3 of Eddy's men were killed, with several others taken prisoner. Batt was later commended by King George for his conduct. Later service. Most of the RFA remained at Fort Cumberland for the duration of the war. In September 1777, a company under command of Stutholm was part of an expeditionary force to the St. John River, sent in response to a rebel expedition to the area. This is the grave of one of the soldiers who served at Fort Cumberland. This is Thomas Dixon's grave at Fort Cumberland, New Brunswick. In the background, you can see the earthworks of the fort. Okay, so they were sent in response to a rebel expedition to the area in 1777. They captured some New England rebels and drove others up the river to secure that part of Nova Scotia, which is now New Brunswick. Many of the men of the RFA, under Stutholm's direction, constructed Fort Howe. Once again, Here is Fort Howe. Okay. Near the mouth, and garrisoned it until the end of the war. In 1777, Gorham had a major dispute with Bath, probably due to Gorham's terms of amnesty granted to the rebels on December 1st, 1776, which were also disapproved of by some parties in Halifax. The regiment was disbanded on October 10, 1783, at Halifax and Fort Howe. Officers and men received land grants plus tools and provisions, if they chose. And Studholme was appointed agent for these arrangements. 14 other ranks took up grants at Remscheid, which is today Loyalist, Nova Scotia, while 57 officers and other ranks are listed as having settled in New Brunswick. Uniforms. For nearly 2 years after its formation, the men of the RFA mostly wore civilian clothing, essentially whatever they were wearing when they enlisted. This caused them great hardship in winter, and Gorham permitted them to wear blankets or rugs in lieu of greatcoats when on sentry at Fort Cumberland. They would have looked very much like the rebel opponents during the siege. Their first uniforms arrived in early 1777, which were green coats faced white with white smallcloths. In common with other Loyalist corps of the American command at that time, officers wore silver lace. By 1780, the regiment was wearing red coats faced black, probably with white lace for other ranks. In popular culture, Thomas Rattle's novel His Majesty's Yankees, written in 1942, is centered around the siege of Fort Cumberland. The Battle of Blomidon took place on 21st May 1781 during the American Revolutionary War. The naval battle involved 3 armed U.S. privateer vessels against 3 Nova Scotian vessels off Cape Split, Nova Scotia. American privateers caught 2 Nova Scotia vessels. The first Nova Scotia vessel was recaptured by Lieutenant Benjamin Belcher. Okay, more on him later. The second Nova Scotia vessel was overtaken by the captured crew under the command of Captain Bishop. The privateers were taken to Cornwallis and put on trial. During the American Revolutionary War, the U.S. regularly attacked Nova Scotia by land and sea. U.S. privateers devastated the maritime economy by raiding many of the coastal communities, such as the numerous raids on Liverpool and Annapolis Royal. Liverpool is here. Annapolis Royal is here. But they were also attacking here. After the British defeated the Penobscot expedition, the U.S. privateers began their most fierce revenge by attacking Nova Scotia. The engagement between the U.S. privateers and local militia was one of the several in the region. On 2nd May 1777, in the Minas Basin, the Captain Collett ordered the capture of the U.S. privateer schooner Sea Duck under the command of John Bohanna. He had the vessel taken to Windsor. There was another raid on the Cornwallis Township in 1778. Cornwallis Township is the old name for Kentville, Nova Scotia. In June 1779, the British forces at Windsor captured 12 U.S. privateers in the Bay of Fundy. On 10th July 1780, the British privateer brig Resolution of 16 guns, under the command of Thomas Ross, engaged the U.S. privateer Viper, who had 22 guns and 130 men, off Halifax at Sambro Light, and what one observer described as one of the bloodiest battles in the history of privateering. The 2 privateers began a severe engagement, during which both pounded each other with cannon fire for about 90 minutes. The engagement resulted in the surrender of the Resolution and the death of up to 18 British and 33 U.S. sailors. So the British lost that one. The battle. There were 30 U.S. privateers and one armed shallop, which is one carriage gun and 6 swivels, and which had one carriage gun and 6 swivels, and 2 whaleboats. They captured Captain Sheffield's schooner. Captain William Bishop, in a small schooner, 35 men, pursued the 3 privateer vessels and their prize. Bishop was in a 25-minute naval battle with the privateers, but was captured by them. Lieutenant Belcher, in the armed sloop Success, with 28 crewmen, pursued the 3 U.S. privateer vessels and the 2 prizes, which were Sheffield's schooner and Bishop's schooner. Belcher caught Sheffield's vessel, killing 1 privateer in the process. Many of the privateers then escaped in their whaleboat to the shores of Cape Split. Belcher then began to pursue Captain Bishop's vessel. During the pursuit, Captain Bishop overthrew his captors and regained command of his schooner. He sent the remaining U.S. privateer prisoners to Cornwallis. Afterward, the U.S. privateers continued to attack vessels in the Bay of Fundy. On August 7, 1781, the British schooner Adventure captured the schooner Mary off Annapolis. In the fall of 1781, under orders of Captain James Nevins, Nevers, different ways of spelling it, Mr. Lowe and the U.S. naval vessel Defense of 18 men went up the Bay of Fundy and was attacked by the Nova Scotia militia. The militia captured 2 of the Americans, while the rest of the crew fled into the woods and were rescued by Acadians. The Battle of Fort Cumberland, once again, happened in 1776, and we already discussed that. Background. Nova Scotia was generally poorly defended in the early stages of the American Revolutionary War, and unrest in the eastern regions provoked fears of an American-led uprising. Although some reinforcements had reached Halifax by early 1776, the frontiers of the province were only lightly defended. Fort Cumberland was located on the Isthmus of Chignecto, which is the connecting part between Nova Scotia, mainland Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. The area was strategically important in earlier conflicts between the French colony of Acadia and British-controlled Nova Scotia. Okay, it was originally built in 1750 as Fort Beauséjour. Fort Cumberland was in... Okay, we'll go on to that. As we talked about the siege earlier, on November 8th, Eddy was joined by 200 men from Cobequid and Pictou, and he finally felt ready to act on November 10, the beginning of the siege. Eddy sent a letter demanding that Gorham surrender his garrison. We already said that before, and Gorham refused and had suggested that Eddy surrender. The next day, authorities outside the area learned of Eddy's activities. Michael Franklin, patrolling in the Bay of Fundy for privateers, recovered a ferry that had been taken, and learned from its passengers that Eddy was active. When the news reached Halifax through the efforts of Thomas Dixon, this guy, Lieutenant Governor Marriott Arbuthnot responded by dispatching orders on the 15th for any available ship based at Annapolis to go to Fort Edward in Windsor to convey convoy troops to relieve the siege. So Commodore Sir George Collier had previously dispatched HMS Vulture into the Bay of Fundy, and on rumors of privateering activity there. And he also ordered HMS Hope to locate Vulture so that he could assist. However, Hope captured a prize and returned to Halifax. She was then sent out again to accompany our supply ship to Fort Cumberland. In the meantime, Vulture fortuitously arrived at Windsor, where she took on some Marines and Fencibles. Lacking artillery, the rebels attempted to storm the fort on the night of November 12th, attempting a feint to draw Gorham Strait away from the weak points of the defenses. The experienced Gorham saw through the feint and repulsed the attack. One of Eddy's Maliseet warriors sneaked into the fort and very nearly opened a gate, but was stopped at the last moment. Following the failed attack, Eddy effectively lost control of the expedition, as a council of leaders formed against him. Night attacks ordered by the council on November 22nd and 23rd succeeded in capturing and burning several buildings, but Gorham grimly held his ground. and the invaders were again repulsed. On November 27th, Vulture arrived. Rather than retreat in the face of arriving relief, the rebels increased their guard. Gorham, with some intelligence about the size of the force opposing him, planned a sortie. Early on the morning of November 29th, Major Thomas Batt led 150 men from Vulture's Marine contingent and the Royal Fencible Americans and scattered Eddy's men, killing and wounding several at the cost of 2 dead and 3 wounded. Batt's men chased Eddy's, but bad weather and the lack of adequate footwear eventually caused them to call off the pursuit. Eddy's forces scattered, with many retreating overland to Maugerville. Some of the Massachusetts men took more than 2 months to reach Machias. Homes and farms of rebel supporters were burned in reprisal, but British authorities took a lenient approach towards captured rebels, including Richard John Uniacke, who went on to become Attorney General of Nova Scotia. Gorham issued an offer of pardon for those who would surrender their arms, which more than 100 locals accepted. This prompted Major Batt to file charges against Gorham for neglect of duty. Gorham was exonerated. The victory at Fort Cumberland strengthened the British presence in Nova Scotia, in part by driving Patriot sympathizers like Allen and Eddy out of the province, but also by cowing those that remained, often by requiring people to make pledges to the Crown. Some unrest continued for the remainder of the war, such as the Battle of Miramichi, although no further large-scale military threat occurred. The most significant attempt occurred in the summer of 1777, when John Allen was authorized by Congress to take actions in Nova Scotia. However, only a small number of forces were raised for this effort at St. John, and a British show of force put an end to the attempt. Eddy appears to have been involved with Allen's work, but his movements prior to August 1777 are uncertain. Commodore Collier followed up by attacking Machias, intending to break Allen's plans. Eddy led the defense of Machias during the battle on August 13th to 15th, 1777. Collier's action was, in fact, unnecessary. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress had in early August voted to disband forces recruited for Allen's expedition because of the imminent threat posed by the army of General John Burgoyne in upstate New York. The Battle of Fort Cumberland was poorly documented in 19th century histories of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, although often receiving only minimal mention. The involvement of local inhabitants, such as natives, Acadians, and English speakers, in the siege was generally understated or unknown. The site of Fort Cumberland has been preserved as a National Historic Site of Canada and is administered by Parks Canada. Starr's Point. Starr's Point is a community in the Canadian province of Nova Scotia, located in King County, about 2 miles or 3 kilometers northeast of Port Williams. Starr's Point faces the Minas Basin to the east and separates the mouths of the Cornwallis River and the Canard River. It is an agricultural area noted for apple orchards, farming, and more recently, vineyards. Port Williams was named after this fellow, Sir William Williams. This is a picture in Province House in Nova Scotia. So, Port Williams is named after this guy. Starr's Point was called Nesogwichik, or Eel Point, or Nesogwichik, prior point between 2 rivers by the Mi'kmaq people. The point was settled by Acadians in late 1600 as part of the Rivière aux Canards settlement, the River of Ducks settlement. It was called Boudreaux's Point, after the Boudreaux family who farmed the point. The Boudreaux also operated a ferry and schooner landing to the north side of the point, along the Cornwallis River called Boudreaux's Bank, where a flat bank or sandstone allowed schooners to safely beach and unload at low tide. Acadians from the Rivière aux Canards settlement were expelled from this point in the 1755 Bay of Fundy campaign of the expulsion of the Acadians, where they marched to Boudreaux's Bank by British troops to be loaded on deportation ships. The New England planters arrived at Boudreaux's Bank on June 4, 1760, to settle the vacated Acadian lands, discovering 60 abandoned ox carts and yokes at the landing, used by the Acadians to take their belongings into exile. The point was intended as the main settlement of the Cornwallis Township settlement, facing the Horton Township on the other side of the Cornwallis River. A town grid for Cornwallis with a parade ground was surveyed around the landing. However, settlers found that nearby Port Williams, Kentville, and Canning made better town sites, leaving the official town site at Starr's Point to develop instead as a rich and productive farmland. The original grid of streets of the Cornwallis town site is today known as the town plot and is marked by a cairn commemorating the arrival of the planters. The community became known as Starr's Point after the Starr family, who emerged as major landowners, led by Major Samuel Starr, one of the first planters settlers in the township. One of the members of the Starr family, John Starr, became an early member of the legislature for Kings County. Here is the plaque at Town Plot at Starr's Point. It reads, "The New England Planters of Cornwallis." And quite a bit of information on that. I recommend people go and visit it sometime. This is Fort Hughes, which is close to Prescott House. It has been an inn for quite a long time, but originally it was a fort. Here's the sign leading into it, and here's Fort Hughes, which is now called something completely different. Okay? In the American Revolution, raids by American privateers against the planter settlements led to the government to build Fort Hughes, Nova Scotia, in 1778, beside the militia parade ground at Starr's Point, a building which survives today as one of the oldest in the area, known as the Planters' Barracks. In 1812, farmers in Starr's Point combined forces with the farmers in Canard to build the Wellington Dyke across the Canard River to the north of Starr's Point. Completed in 1825, the dike protects 3,000 acres along the north side of Starr's Point, formerly submerged by tides of the Minas Basin. Charles Ramage Prescott chose Starr's Point to establish a large farm and country estate in 1812, which played an important role in developing the area's apple industry. Today's home, Prescott House, is now a provincial museum. The Fox Hill Cemetery dates back to 1762, named for Cornelius Fox, a teacher at the small school located in Starr's Point. Burial here includes local residents including Burbage, Belcher, Rand, Gates, and the Rand family operated a popular dairy farm here for 6 generations, with the recent generations adding cheese production. Before we spoke of the Battle of Blomidon, privateers. Here's the information about it. The date was 21st May 1781, and this is Captain William Bishop Sword. It's at the Kings County Museum in Nova Scotia. That'd be in Kentville. Okay, so it was off Wolfville, Nova Scotia, in the muddy area in the Minas Basin. It was a British victory. On the American side were 28 privateers, and on the British side was one schooner of 35 men and success of 28 men. Casualties and losses: the Americans lost 1 person and British side lost no one. And here is Lieutenant Benjamin Belcher, who is the namesake of Belcher Street in Port Williams, Nova Scotia.